Hey guys, tonight we travel back not just a few years, not even centuries, but across millennia to walk the dusty, starlit path of cities that once held the title or at least the burden of being a capital of something called Israel. Spoiler alert, there's more than one. In fact, depending on how you count, there are 9 cities that have held the crown, officially, temporarily, or symbolically. That's more capital hopping than a hyperactive chessboard. And tonight you'll tiptoe through each one, from tribal settlements to contested holy cities, and see how the idea of a capital in Israel is a story more tangled than your bed sheets by morning. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And tell me, where are you watching from and what time is it there? Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You begin not in Jerusalem nor in Tel Aviv, but somewhere you probably wouldn't expect: Jericho. Palm trees sway above ancient stone walls. The air is thick with the scent of figs, and the Jordan River slinks lazily nearby. Jericho is one of the oldest continuously inhabited cities in the world. But oddly enough, it never quite made it as a capital. You wander through its winding paths and mud brick alleys, and though the city pulses with ancient energy, it feels more like a grandmother's kitchen than a throne room. Still, it held power in its bones. When the Israelites first crossed the Jordan after their desert wandering, Jericho was their first target. You hear the echo of trumpets in the distance, 7 days of marching, then a final shout, and the walls fell. But despite this dramatic entrance, Jericho wasn't chosen to lead. Why? Maybe it was too exposed, too symbolic of conquest rather than settlement. Or maybe, as some scholars muse, it just lacked the tribal neutrality to unite Israel's feuding clans. Historians still argue whether its early role was foundational or fleeting. But the truth is, Jericho was always too storied, too haunted to be ordinary. So the journey continues. You step westward through time and terrain into the highlands, into a city that's much less famous but once held the promise of something bigger: Shechem. Tucked between Mount Ebal and Mount Gerizim, Shechem is all about location. It sits at a tribal crossroads, a place where covenant was renewed and decisions were made, sometimes peacefully, sometimes bloodily. When Joshua called the tribes together to remind them of their oath to God, it happened here. That kind of stage presence doesn't come easy. Shechem flirted with leadership, especially during the early days when Israel wasn't a kingdom, but more of a confederation of tribes. Think loose cousins at a family reunion who sort of get along until land rights come up. You imagine the elders gathered under an oak tree, debating boundaries, trading goats, and whispering about which judge was being a little too judgy. It wasn't a capital in the modern sense, but more like a regional HQ. A proto-capital, if you will. And yet, even Shechem didn't last long in that role. Political gravity started pulling elsewhere, and soon leadership, if you can call it that, began to swirl around other more spiritually loaded places, like a town named Shiloh. But don't worry, you'll get there. You take one last look back at Jericho and Shechem, both places that might have been, nearly were, or briefly stood at the center of a swirling, sacred story. capitals not because someone declared them so, but because people gathered, choices were made, and history lingered. You leave the tribal echoes of Shechem behind and walk northward, your sandals kicking up the red dust of history. Up a gentle rise, nestled between hills where olives stretch toward the sky, you arrive at Shiloh, the quiet, unassuming town that once held Israel's greatest treasure. This is where the Ark of the Covenant lived. Not in a stone vault, not hidden in a warehouse a la Indiana Jones, but inside a tabernacle, portable, sacred, and guarded like the beating heart of the people. For 369 years, give or take a few, depending on how ancient manuscripts round their numbers, Shiloh was the place to be. The spiritual HQ, the not quite capital that still ruled the calendar and conscience. You walk through imagined rows of tents and stone dwellings, picturing the pilgrims arriving for yearly feasts. Some came barefoot, others with doves or grain or guilt, and at the center of it all, the tabernacle flapping in the breeze, heavy with incense and expectation. You pause outside it, even though it's long gone. The ground still feels like it remembers. What's fascinating is that Shiloh never had a king, no palace, no government buildings. It was holy, not political, or so it claimed. Historians still argue whether Shiloh functioned as a true capital or merely a ceremonial one, but either way, it held sway. If Jerusalem is the crown, Shiloh was the heartbeat, but power without muscle rarely lasts forever. You hear the whispers of a disastrous day. Philistine drums pounding, priests panicking, and the ark being captured. That's right, the actual ark stolen, like someone breaking into Fort Knox and walking out with national identity. Shiloh never recovered. Its fall was so dramatic that later prophets used it as a warning. Don't make your city like Shiloh. Ouch. Still, the legacy remains. Some archaeologists claim to have found remnants of the tabernacle platform. Others suggest sacred boundary stones still dot the hills. You look around, trying to see through time, and realize this wasn't just a place of worship. It was a place of transition, from tribal chaos to something closer to nationhood. And just like that, you're pulled forward again into the dust clouds of monarchy. Because once kings arrive, capitals change. And Israel was about to get a king who didn't like stairs. You squint toward the sun as it rises over a hill, and before you know it, you're in Hebron. It doesn't look like much now. Stone alleys, modest rooftops, market stalls yawning open for the morning. But for a brief and flickering moment in Israel's history, this place was royalty. This was King David's first capital. Yes, that David, harp playing, giant slaying, dance in the streets David. But before Jerusalem, before golden arches and temple dreams, David ruled from Hebron. Not by accident. Hebron already held gravitas. It was the burial site of the patriarchs. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. That's like putting your presidential office in Arlington Cemetery. Here, David was crowned by the tribe of Judah. Just one tribe, mind you. The rest weren't quite on board yet. It was more of a regional kingship, a sort of beta test of monarchy. Still, Hebron saw David's first 7 years as king, and if walls could talk, They'd whisper of royal dinners, tribal negotiations, and a lot of sandal dust being tracked across palace floors. But why Hebron? It wasn't the biggest or the richest. Scholars think it was strategic, deep in Judahite territory, surrounded by loyalty and insulated from rebellion. Also, stairs. Jerusalem sat on a fortress hill held by Jebusites, and David didn't own it yet. Hebron was available, sacred, and ready. Historians still argue whether Hebron was chosen for piety, politics, or pure convenience. It could have been all three. What's clear is that Hebron marks the first time a single ruler united faith, tribe, and territory. Even if only partially. A symbolic nod to what might come. But Hebron didn't last. 7 years in, David packed up, marched north, and took a city whose name would outshine all the others. Jerusalem. Still, Hebron never lost its claim. It remained sacred ground, a burial city, a spiritual landmark. A place to begin but not to stay, and so, like David himself, you leave Hebron behind, not out of disrespect but inevitability. There are bigger stories ahead, and they all lead to a city on a hill with more names than it has gates. You follow the dusty trail north, feet crunching through brittle grass until the hills flatten and the whispers of the wilderness grow hushed. Ahead of you is a simple rise, barely a hill really. But it held something powerful. Shiloh. Before Jerusalem, before temples and incense and giant stone altars. Before even David, there was this, a quiet spot in central Canaan where the Israelites set up camp, permanently, or at least for 369 years. That's how long the Ark of the Covenant stayed here. That's right, the Ark. Gold-covered, cherub-topped, thunder-in-a-box ark. Shiloh became the spiritual capital long before Israel had kings. This was where the tabernacle stood, where tribes gathered for festivals, and where you could, quite literally, hear the voice of God, if you were Samuel at least. Historians still argue whether this early centralization was organized priestly strategy or a fortunate accident of geography. But one thing's for sure, Shiloh meant something. Not grand, not mighty, but central, both physically and emotionally. You pass through its now ruined gates where once thousands might have come to offer sacrifices or share harvest feasts. Back then, no one needed a palace. They had tents and presents. You can almost smell the mingling of animal offerings and desert air, hear the buzz of market traders and the rustle of Levite robes. But Shiloh didn't last. The Philistines came. The ark was captured. The town was likely destroyed, and just like that, Israel's first holy city faded into myth, eclipsed by later glories. No stone temple, no royal lineage, just a footnote, unless you're one of the few still paying attention. You sit on a sun-warmed rock where priests may have once prayed. You wonder, what does it mean for a capital to be invisible now, and yet still echo? Because Shiloh wasn't a capital in the modern sense, but it was unmistakably the beating heart of a people in search of identity, a people still intense, still in flux, and for a while that was enough. You descend from the silence of Shiloh and begin weaving your way further north. The landscape grows harsher, the sun less forgiving, and the stones underfoot sharper. as if warning you that this next chapter won't be gentle. Ahead lies Samaria, the capital that no one talks about. But once it stood proud, once it was royal. After the kingdom split north and south, Israel and Judah, Jerusalem no longer ruled over all. The 10 northern tribes chose their own kings, their own prophets, their own paths. And eventually, under King Omri, they chose a new capital, Samaria. You reach the remains now, climbing its tall hill that commands a sweeping view of the valleys below. Strategic, yes, but also defiant. Samaria was built not just to govern, but to rival, a political counterpoint to Jerusalem. Brick for stone, altar for altar. Historians still argue whether Samaria's rise was pure power politics or a deliberate theological rebellion. The Bible certainly wasn't fond of it. Samaria became synonymous with idolatry, foreign alliances, and those pesky golden calves. But even so, it flourished. Monumental buildings, aqueducts, imports from Phoenicia and beyond. It was a city meant to impress. And for a time it did. Under kings like Ahab and his infamous wife Jezebel, yes, that Jezebel, Samaria sparkled. Ivory palaces, painted walls, diplomats from Tyre and Sidon. If Jerusalem was sacred, Samaria was stylish. It was the capital of a kingdom that was wealthier, more populous, and arguably more sophisticated than its southern cousin. But time is cruel to forgotten capitals. The Assyrians came in 722 BCE. Siege, slaughter, exile, and after that, nothing. Samaria vanished into rubble, its name recycled by enemies. Its stories buried under centuries of silence. You pick up a fragment of pottery, just a curve of a bowl, sun-bleached and smooth. It belonged to someone who once lived at the heart of this kingdom. You imagine their mourning, pouring water, baking bread, watching smoke rise from the palace kitchens. And now, just wind, dust, and the buzz of distant bees. Samaria's tragedy wasn't just conquest, it was erasure. Jerusalem survived, Samaria did not, and maybe that's why we don't talk about it. We forget the capitals that lose. But here, standing on this overgrown hill, you remember. You leave the whispering stones of Samaria behind and travel south again, toward the city that never forgets its name, Jerusalem. The road climbs slowly, winding past olive groves and sun-baked terraces, until the skyline begins to emerge, not grand but layered. Minarets, domes, ramparts, a city built in strata like a memory etched over itself again and again. Jerusalem wasn't always destined to be the heart of Israel. It's not the most strategic. It doesn't sit on a major river or port. Its resources are modest, and yet it endures. Not by logic, but by symbol. You enter through the ancient gate and feel it immediately, that strange cocktail of tension and reverence. Pilgrims whisper, vendors shout, the air crackles, but not from heat, from meaning. King David didn't found Jerusalem, he conquered it from the Jebusites. Historians still argue whether that choice was political genius or divine compulsion. Either way, it worked. He brought the Ark of the Covenant here. He made it sacred. And ever since, Jerusalem has played a game of historical leapfrog, shifting between religious epicenter, military stronghold, and diplomatic headache. Solomon's temple gave it glory, Babylon burned it, Persians let it rise again, Greeks painted it with Hellenism, Romans stomped it down. And each time it returned like a stubborn ghost. You stand near the Temple Mount where history folds in on itself. Jews pray at the Western Wall. Muslims ascend to the Dome of the Rock. Christians trace the footsteps of Jesus. One hill, 3 faiths, 9 million layers of unresolved emotion. Even today, Jerusalem's status is debated, claimed, reclaimed, split in maps and minds. Some see it as Israel's eternal capital. Others see it as a future Palestinian capital. Most see it as the center of everything, a compass that points not north but inward. There's no breeze today. The city holds its breath. A cat slips between your legs, nonchalant like it owns the holy stones. You smile. Even here, the mundane coexists with the divine. The irony, the city of peace, Yerushalayim, has rarely known peace. But its staying power lies not in serenity but in symbolism. Cities can be razed, symbols live on. You sit on a low wall, watching sunlight gild the old stones. The call to prayer rises, echoing off rooftops. Somewhere a church bell joins in, then fades. You close your eyes. This city doesn't just contain history. It is history. Still pulsing, still fought over, still sacred. You open your eyes to the present, but Jerusalem doesn't let you stay there for long. As you walk away from the old city walls, you pass embassies, checkpoints, and souvenir shops, each claiming a piece of the past, each layered over something older. But the world keeps spinning, and not all capitals are eternal. Now your path takes you to the early 20th century, to a different kind of capital. One with no ancient walls, no temples, no prophets, just sand, sea, and vision. Welcome to Tel Aviv. You squint against the glare of white Bauhaus buildings and salty sunlight. It's the opposite of Jerusalem in nearly every way. Born in 1909 from dunes and dreams, Tel Aviv was built by idealists and engineers, not kings. No miracles required, just zoning plans and ambition. After Israel declared independence in 1948, Tel Aviv acted as the de facto capital. David Ben-Gurion read the declaration there, not in Jerusalem. Ministries operated from Tel Aviv. Foreign embassies set up shop by the beach. Why? Because Jerusalem was still under siege. Historians still argue whether Tel Aviv was ever meant to be a real capital, or just a placeholder. Like when your power goes out and you light candles, knowing the lights will come back, but not quite sure when. You pass by a modest building that once housed the Prime Minister's office. No grandeur, just functionality. That was Tel Aviv's charm. It was a working city, a city of cafes, not crusades. For over a decade, many nations refused to recognize Jerusalem as Israel's capital, and Tel Aviv stood in. But it wore the title lightly. It knew its place wasn't eternal, it was provisional. Still, Tel Aviv grew into something more than a capital. It became the pulse of Israel, its economic center, its cultural heart. The place where startups bloom, parties stretch past midnight, and ideas leap from boardrooms to rooftops. You sip a mint lemonade and watch the breeze comb through the palms. No monument marks Tel Aviv's time as capital. But perhaps that's the point. It was never about stone and tadal. It was about survival, adaptation, momentum. And when the embassies started moving back to Jerusalem in the 1980s, Tel Aviv didn't protest, it kept dancing. A boy on a skateboard zooms past, earbuds in, shirt untucked. He doesn't know or care that this sidewalk once carried the weight of a nation's decisions. He just wants ice cream, and maybe that's the best kind of legacy. You leave the surf and startups of Tel Aviv behind, heading east, uphill, both literally and politically. The terrain rises as the landscape shifts. Concrete gives way to tension. Billboards turn into watchtowers. You pass through checkpoints, and soon you arrive in a place both central and sidelined. Ramallah, not a capital by proclamation, not a capital by global consensus. But walk its streets, and you'll feel something different, a weight, a pulse. This is where the Palestinian Authority has its headquarters, where embassies to Palestine are stationed, where journalists flock, politicians confer, and the world occasionally pretends decisions are made. It is in many practical ways a capital, just not officially. Historians still argue whether Ramallah is a temporary seat or a permanent concession. The Oslo Accords didn't clarify, the peace talks didn't resolve, and the maps, they all disagree. One moment Ramallah is the de facto capital of Palestine. The next it's a line item in an unresolved status document. You cross El Irsal Street. Above you, Palestinian flags flutter beside photos of leaders, some smiling, some defiant. A nearby wall is layered with graffiti, doves, olive branches, a child with a slingshot. In Ramallah, symbolism is everywhere. So is contradiction. This city was once a small Christian village, known for olive oil and quiet hills. Today it's a center of administration, protest, and paradox. It has upscale cafes and armored jeeps, tech startups and water shortages, international NGOs and internet outages. Ramallah contains multitudes, and all of them are waiting. You pass a government building where the sign reads Ministry of Culture. Inside, someone is playing oud music. Outside, someone is being questioned by soldiers. The juxtaposition isn't jarring anymore, it's just Ramallah. There's a kind of weary rhythm here. People go to work, children attend school. Life continues even when sovereignty doesn't. The city hums with the tension of paused ambition. You overhear a young man at a newsstand say, "One day it'll be Al-Quds." He means Jerusalem. He says it with hope, but also with the flat tone of someone who's said it too many times before. Ramallah is a placeholder with soul, a capital not of maps but of minds. It makes you wonder, what makes a capital real? A signature? A ceremony? Or simply the fact that people live, fight, and dream there? You buy a coffee from a roadside stand. The vendor asks where you're from. You say, "Just visiting." He nods slowly like he's heard that 1,000 times before. And maybe you are. But Ramallah isn't going anywhere. You descend from Ramallah back toward Jerusalem. But this time you're not chasing capitals. You're chasing contradictions. Because if you've learned anything so far, it's this. Israel's capitals don't play by the usual rules. They're layered like baklava, sweet, political and full of complex fillings. Most countries have one capital. Israel? It has at least three, depending on which newspaper, passport office, or peace accord you're reading. First, there's Jerusalem, claimed as the eternal and indivisible capital by Israel and enshrined in its basic laws. Then there's Tel Aviv, the actual location of many embassies, international delegations, and meetings where people pretend everything is normal. And of course, there's Ramallah, where Palestinians plan and resist and persist even without recognition. This patchwork isn't an accident. It's a feature, a living example of how politics, history, and asphalt all collide. Historians still argue whether Israel ever really wanted one capital or just inherited chaos. Some say the multiple capitals are temporary. Others say they're a permanent side effect of permanent instability. The truth, like everything else in this region, depends on your angle of entry and exit. You walk through a security gate near the Knesset, Israel's parliament. It's in West Jerusalem, a short ride from the Supreme Court, the president's residence, and the prime minister's office. So by any standard measure, this should be the capital. But most foreign embassies didn't move here until recently. Why? Because until the U.S. recognized Jerusalem as Israel's capital in 2017, doing so was diplomatic dynamite. You sip water on a bench facing the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. The building looks official. Columns, flags, the works. But behind you, a tour guide tells her group, and over here is the U.S. Embassy in Tel Aviv. Someone coughs awkwardly. That's the dance. De jure versus de facto. What the law says versus what the world acknowledges. One city has the rituals, another the receptions, a third the resistance. You walk into a gift shop. There are postcards labeled "Greetings from Jerusalem," "Made in Tel Aviv," and one solitary magnet that reads "Ramallah Vibes." You buy it. It feels honest. Even within Israel's own population, the question of capital isn't just geographic, it's ideological. To many religious Jews, the Temple Mount makes Jerusalem spiritually untouchable. To secular Israelis, Tel Aviv feels more like home. And to Palestinians, the capital of their dreams remains just out of reach, on the other side of a barrier, literal and metaphorical. You pause to look at a map, not a political map, a tourist one. It highlights museums, ruins, bus lines, but even here some borders are blurred. Some neighborhoods are dotted, not drawn. The legend simply says areas of dispute. You smile. It's the most honest thing on the page. Because if you want to understand why Israel has so many capitals, you have to let go of neatness. There is no single seat of power, no clear throne. There's just a quilt, stitched together by compromise, theology, trauma, and the occasional stubborn olive tree. And somehow it holds. You wander down a side street, shoes dusty, thoughts heavier than your steps. But that's the thing about history here. It doesn't wait politely on museum plaques. It ambushes you at crosswalks, stares from limestone walls, and whispers from minarets and bell towers. So far, you've walked through royal ambitions, divine revelations, and colonial redrawing. But now it's time to talk about a different kind of capital. Not one written in laws or on signs, but one written into hearts. Because for many, Jerusalem is not the capital because it functions. It's the capital because it feels like the center of the universe. The spiritual pull of Jerusalem goes beyond borders. Jews face it when they pray. Muslims revere it as the site of Al-Aqsa, the night journey's final step. Christians retrace the path of Jesus through its cobbled streets. It's a city where people argue over who has the keys to heaven, while pigeons nest in the cracks of ancient fortresses. You duck into a shaded courtyard near the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. A monk sweeps fallen leaves with monk-like patience. In this place, even the wind feels choreographed. Historians still argue whether the city's sacredness was the reason for its political centrality, or if its political relevance birthed the sacred stories. Like the old chicken or egg dilemma, except here it's temple or throne. But what makes Jerusalem's capital status so unique is that it's both personal and impersonal. Everyone claims it. No one completely owns it. You sip a pomegranate juice from a stall near Damascus Gate. The vendor grins. "Welcome to the center of the world," he says, not sarcastically. And maybe he's right, because here, capital isn't just where decisions are made. It's where destinies are argued over tea, tears, treaties, and Twitter threads. You pass a mural of doves painted over bullet holes. It's beautiful, and a little sad, like most things in this city. And while other nations build capitals on convenience, geography, or conquest, Jerusalem endures because it's bigger than all three. A city where every alley has a witness. Every wall remembers something you've forgotten. You take a deep breath. Somewhere nearby, a shofar sounds. Somewhere else, a church bell rings. And somewhere else still, a call to prayer rises gently into the blue. It's loud, it's quiet, it's messy, it's holy, and it's definitely a capital, just not one that will ever sit still long enough to be mapped. You blink in the sunlight as the city changes again. Not spiritually, but administratively. The story now shifts from the sacred to the bureaucratic. Because while Jerusalem was burning with symbolism, modern powers had other priorities: paperwork, railways, and reliable lighting. Welcome to the Ottoman and British Mandate era, when capitals were less about prophecy and more about postal codes. You picture yourself in a dusty Ottoman office, somewhere in the late 1800s. A man in a fez argues over ledgers while a cat naps on top of a tax scroll. Jerusalem at this point isn't the grand capital of an empire, it's just a mid-tier district in a very large empire. Think provincial, not presidential. But the Ottomans laid some infrastructure foundations like water pipes and schools. And while Jerusalem wasn't declared an official capital in any grand ceremony, it did start to feel more like one, simply because more people were watching it, including the British. When World War I ended and the Ottomans lost control, the British Mandate took over like a new landlord. And what did they do? Made Jerusalem their administrative headquarters. Not Tel Aviv, not Haifa, Jerusalem. Because even if it was a logistical nightmare with its hills and holy sites and housing shortages, it had weight. You walk along a preserved British-era stone building now. A plaque outside says it used to house a commissioner's office. Sounds fancy, but probably involved a lot of ink stains and passive-aggressive memos. Historians still argue whether the British chose Jerusalem out of reverence, strategy, or a desire to make their mandate feel more dramatic. Maybe it was all three. After all, they loved a good narrative, and Jerusalem came preloaded with one. What's quirky is that the British built in a style you'd recognize today. Solid neoclassical facades, red-tiled roofs, and a tendency to put clocks on everything. It's like they were trying to out-administer the Ottomans. But even with British structure, the idea of capital stayed ambiguous. Tel Aviv, that shiny new coastal town, was already rising in economic power. Yet Jerusalem clung to its title not by efficiency, but by inertia, ritual, and symbolism. You grab a tea at a British-style cafe, ginger biscuits included, and imagine the strange calm of those mandate years. The quiet before the very loud storm of statehood. Here, capital was less about where laws were written, and more about where history refused to sit still. You hear the waves first, soft, rhythmic, almost apologetic. Then the scent of salt, of brine, and sun-warmed sand. This is not Jerusalem, this is Tel Aviv, a city that rose not from prophecy, but from paperwork and sea breezes. You squint at the horizon and imagine what this place looked like in 1909. Just a handful of families drawing plots in the sand with seashells. Fast forward a few decades and Tel Aviv is bustling, modern, electric. So why isn't this Israel's capital? Well, it sort of was for a while, but don't get too comfortable, because temporary in Israel has a habit of lasting far longer than anyone plans. After declaring independence in 1948, the newly formed Israeli government couldn't quite move into Jerusalem right away. Parts of the city were under Jordanian control, and the whole place was tense, armed, divided, and spiritually overloaded. So Tel Aviv, ever the pragmatic younger sibling, stepped up. Ministries were established, leaders worked from modest buildings, and reporters typed headlines near cafes with good espresso. For a moment, Tel Aviv was the nerve center of the new nation. Historians still argue whether Tel Aviv was ever truly the capital or just holding Jerusalem's place like a diligent understudy. Official documents called it the temporary seat of government, but it hosted embassies, prime ministers, and international delegations. You know, like a capital. There's something charming about Tel Aviv's reluctant glory. It didn't ask for the spotlight. It just had better parking and air conditioning. You stroll down Rothschild Boulevard and picture David Ben-Gurion reading a speech from a converted art gallery. No marble pillars, no throne, just folding chairs and history crackling on the radio. The quirk? Even when Jerusalem was formally declared the capital, many countries, including big ones like the US, kept their embassies in Tel Aviv. It was a quiet protest, or maybe just convenience. Diplomacy is 30% ideology and 70% where the airport is. And that's how Tel Aviv, the city that began as a neighborhood experiment, became a semi-capital for decades. It had no holy sites, but it had cafes that didn't close on Saturdays. It wasn't crowned, but it was efficient. In the realm of capitals, that's rare. So while Jerusalem was busy being sacred, Tel Aviv handled the spreadsheets. Someone had to. Now you're crossing into uncertain territory, quite literally. The city ahead, Ramallah, is bustling with honking taxis, market chatter, and the smell of grilled lamb in the air. But here's the catch. It's the capital, and also not the capital. You step through streets where banners flap above political posters and everything feels a little layered, administratively, emotionally, symbolically. Welcome to the de facto administrative center of the Palestinian Authority. Ramallah wasn't always the heart of Palestinian governance. In fact, it wasn't even on the radar for centuries. But over time, as borders shifted and peace talks fizzled, this small city took on an enormous identity. Unofficial capital of a country that isn't officially a country. You pass the presidential compound, modest by capital standards, and imagine the quiet frustration of running a government without full recognition. Palestine has declared Jerusalem as its capital. Many nations agree. But the offices, the speeches, the staffers with ID lanyards, they're here in Ramallah. Historians still argue whether this makes Ramallah a placeholder or a paradox. Either way, it's an administrative fact of life. Ministers meet here. International aid flows through here. Journalists wait outside buildings trying to get statements that won't age poorly within 24 hours. And in the middle of it all, everyday life. Children with backpacks dodge puddles. Grandmothers sell olives in plastic tubs. A shopkeeper yells out prices in 3 languages. Capital or not, Ramallah functions. Just not always on paper. The strange part, Israel has its own share of unofficial capitals. The Ministry of Defense is in Tel Aviv. The High Court sits in Jerusalem. And foreign embassies, they've played musical chairs between the two for decades. You start to feel like you're collecting capitals like stamps. Hebron, Shiloh, Samaria, Jerusalem, Tel Aviv, Ramallah. Each one layered with politics, religion, and a little chaos. You wonder if there's a punch card. Visit 9 capitals, get a free hummus plate. The reality? Ramallah represents hope to some, frustration to others, and bureaucratic practicality to everyone else. You might not see it on glossy tourist maps, but its heartbeat is real and its role undeniable. Even without the crown, it rules. You walk now with a growing awareness. Israel isn't just a country with one capital. It's a mosaic of shifting centers, each with its own moment in the sun, each leaving behind a footprint. And while most nations take their capitals for granted, Israel treats them like seasonal clothing, rotated based on function, symbolism, or necessity. You arrive at a quiet hill overlooking the Knesset, the Israeli parliament, set like a stone monument against a backdrop of olive trees and construction cranes. It looks modern but heavy with purpose, and this is the official capital, Jerusalem. Or at least it's supposed to be, but like every capital you've visited on this winding journey, its status depends on who's asking. International law, foreign embassies, religious authorities, local municipalities, all have slightly different answers to the same question. Where does power live? Even within Israel's own system, things are decentralized. Military command often flows from Tel Aviv. Judicial decisions emanate from Jerusalem. Economic planning happens in outposts and industrial zones far from either. And some argue the real influence lies in settlements, lobby meetings, and WhatsApp groups you'll never see. Historians still argue whether this fragmented structure is intentional brilliance or logistical nightmare. But it works, at least well enough to keep the machinery of state humming along, even if the engine's scattered across the map. Then there's the religious layer. No other country claims a city sacred to three major faiths as its capital. The result? A capital that isn't just political, it's celestial, mythical, incendiary. Protests happen here, prayers happen here, and sometimes they overlap in unsettling ways. You stroll past a modest coffee cart where two students debate legal theory in Hebrew. Down the block, a priest unlocks a wooden chapel door. A few minutes later, you see a crowd entering a mosque for prayer. All within one city, all within one afternoon. You pause and think maybe the true capital of Israel isn't a single point on a map, but the friction, faith, and function spread between them. A kind of distributed sovereignty. That idea doesn't fit neatly on a postage stamp. But then again, neither does the country's history. You continue through Jerusalem as twilight begins to settle in. A golden hush falling over domes, towers, antennas, and terraces. If you squint, you can almost layer every capital you've visited across this land onto one transparent map. They don't cancel each other out. They shimmer like echoes. And now comes the strangest part. Israel's capital count isn't just about history, it's still changing. In East Jerusalem, contested claims and checkpoints mark where one authority ends and another insists it begins. Some maps call it Israel, others call it Palestine. Some residents say both, or neither. It depends on the day, the mood, the politics. Meanwhile, Ramallah continues to function like a capital for Palestine. Ministries, headquarters, foreign envoys, even national holidays unfold from this modest hillside city. Yet officially, Jerusalem remains the true capital in Palestinian national documents. Two capitals, one claim. Zero agreement. You sip a mint tea from a rooftop cafe and look out across this complex quilt of cities. From Hebron's ancient tombs to Tel Aviv's high-rises, from Shiloh's ruins to the Knesset's polished floors, each site has worn the crown for a time. Some by conquest, some by compromise, some by quiet administrative inertia. And here's the kicker. Israel may not be done yet. Historians still argue whether the future will bring a final, singular capital or an ever-evolving set of functional zones like organs in a living, arguing body. Some predict a federation. Others whisper about confederacy, dual state systems, or some unexpected third model no one's named yet. But almost all agree the concept of capital in this region will never be simple. You descend from the rooftop. The air smells like orange blossoms and diesel. Someone nearby plays a flute. It's not a national anthem, but it might as well be. You walk a little slower now, letting the streetlights flicker on around you. Not because you're lost, but because you've seen how many centers a single country can hold, how many pasts can live in one present, how many futures are waiting, each with its own flag, story, and maybe its own capital. You don't reach a conclusion, because Israel hasn't either. And now you ease back from the map. You let the cities dissolve, the domes soften, the politics blur. You're no longer tracing capitals, just resting in the rhythm of their stories. The flicker of torchlight in Hebron, the scent of olive wood in Shiloh, the ruined grandeur of Samaria, all fade into a soft collective memory, the way light fades into dusk and dust settles after ceremony. Jerusalem glows in your mind's eye, but not as a place of headlines. Just a quiet hill where someone once built something, prayed something, or promised something. A city older than your doubts, stronger than your assumptions. Let the borders rest tonight. Let every disputed document sleep folded in its drawer. You've wandered far, from tented altars to marble halls, and the only thing heavier than the history is the peace you feel now, knowing that nothing is final and everything has been tried. You exhale. The air is still, the cities so loud by day now whisper only in stone. The past has paused, waiting for the future to catch its breath. Sleep now, traveler. Let the roads you walk tonight become paths in your dreams. Let capitals blur into candlelight. Let the quiet win, just this once. You are safe, you are still, and the world is turning gently just as it always has.